Welcome back to everyone. We know you're coming back into the main room, and we know you were all having wonderful conversations that were cut abruptly. We're sorry for that. We're on such a tight timeline today. But welcome back. It looks like most of you are in our room, and just a huge thanks again to our speakers just now and panelists talking during those 4 concurrent sessions. We're so appreciative. So we're coming down the end of our journey together, and next up, I am pleased to welcome back Rabbi Laura Geller, who's going to introduce our next segment on multi-generational programs. Laura, over to you.
So we've already heard a lot about multi-generational programs. Ken and Jay referred to it. The talk on the panel Active Aging Hubs also spoke about cogenerational opportunities. I just came out of a wonderful workshop on volunteerism, and it really does seem a lot to be about multi-generational, cogenerational opportunities. And, you know, this day has been so rich. We've heard from these wonderful sessions how our world is changing, and the map of our life is so different now from what it's been in the past. You know, this huge cohort of people in this new life stage between midlife and frail old age. And it's so wonderful, the challenge of Ken, but the truth is that our Jewish community is beginning to pay attention. That's why there are so many partners on this day. And all of you around this in this convening are the ones who are making this happen through the programs and the projects that are focused on active older adults. We heard this morning that at the same time, something else is happening in the world. This is the first time in human history that 5 or 6, according to Ken, generations are alive at the same time. And in North America, at least, this is the most age-segregated society that has ever existed. Olders and youngers are separated and siloed through social policy, legacy institutions, stereotyping, and ageism. This has even been called age apartheid. Think about that, age apartheid. And we know that there's a narrative of generational conflict. Okay, boomers, you screwed up the world, now get out of the way. Or the story of kids versus canes. But as we're beginning to hear, there's a new wind that's blowing across the country, a story of generations working together to make a difference in the world. Telling that story is the work of cogeneration, which evolved out of an organization called Encore.org, the organization that first paid attention to active older adults and gave us the concept of Encore careers. Now it's focusing on ways that that cohort can enrich their lives and change the world along with people of all ages, especially younger people. So I am really delighted to welcome Janet O, the Senior Director of Innovation at CoGenerate, to share with us why cogeneration is important, not only to active older adults, but also to the world, what cogeneration is, and how you can connect and benefit from the work of CoGenerate with the leadership that you all work with. And then we'll imagine what it would look like to bring this lens of generations working together to our Jewish world, reframing Lador Vador, from generation to Dor im Dor, generations working together to make a difference with listening, with wisdom, with leadership, and imagination flowing in both directions. And then we'll hear one brief story of a Jewish cogenerational project that has made a difference in the life of one active adult. Again, there's so much to talk about. We're not going to have time for questions, but again, please put all your questions in the chat. Remember, they'll be copied and the chat will be shared with everybody who registered. And hopefully we'll be able to schedule other opportunities to have more in-depth Zoom gatherings, beginning with your questions. So Janet O, welcome.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. So nice to be with all of you. I see some familiar faces, which is really nice. So I just wanted to share a quick personal story on how I got involved in this work. One of my first real jobs out of college was working for a program called Experience Corps, which I'm guessing many of you know. It's now run by AARP, and that's a program that connected retirees with elementary school students. And one of our volunteers was a retired professor named Rich Yerman. And Rich came to us because he had what he described as a ticking clock to become a grandfather. And he thought that his adult son would not have kids of his own. So he took matters into his own hands. He signed up to be a tutor. We paired him with a little girl named Rose, who was a third grader and a recent immigrant from China who was learning English. And Rich and Rose, through their weekly sessions, discovered a joint love of poetry, and they published a book of poems, which I actually was able to dig up yesterday on my bookshelf. As you can see, they hit it off. And Rich actually followed Rose from third grade to fourth grade to fifth grade and graduated with her to middle school. And when I look back, that was almost 20 years ago, and still Rich and Rose are so clear in my mind. And I think that's because it was so much more than a literacy program. It was so much more than a volunteer program. It was really an example of humans doing what only humans can do. It was about connection. It was about interdependence. Rich and Rose were solving each other's problems. They were filling each other's hearts. It was about joy and silliness and poems about ice cream, and it was about being together. And so today, what I want to talk about is this concept of cogeneration, which our organization has been putting out into the world. So co in Latin means together. So think collaboration, the word connection, the word community. So we define cogeneration as a strategy to bring younger and older people together, to bridge differences, combat ageism, break down stereotypes, and help solve society's biggest problems. And the big problem that I've been thinking about in the last few weeks and months is what the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, calls the epidemic of loneliness. And you might be familiar with this report that was recently put out by his office. So I'll just share some of these statistics. You probably already know them, but just to get it kind of centered in our minds and in our hearts. But 1 in 2 adults in America report experiencing loneliness. 1 in 2. So that's half of us. That means that at that rate, no one is left untouched. Loneliness is something that we ourselves experience, or it's our neighbor, or it's our brother or sister, or our children, or our parents. And I'm sure that this group knows better than I do the physical health consequences related to loneliness for adults. It includes a 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. And in addition, lacking social connection increases the risk of premature death by more than 60%. So those statistics are really hard to hear, right? But they're not surprising, I'm guessing, for many of us. But personally, as a mother, the thing that never fails to shock me is the loneliness of our young people. That 61% of young people ages 18 to 25 report experiencing profound loneliness, including feeling lonely all of the time. And that loneliness is linked to the youth mental health crisis. So Vivek Murthy says that this public health epidemic of loneliness is something that's hidden in plain sight. But there's good news. It's not all doom and gloom. The good news is that the solution is also hidden in plain sight. And I think that solution kind of brings us back to this connection between Rich and Rose. So according to the Stanford Center on Longevity, we are living in the most age-diverse society in human history, with almost equal numbers of people of every age from birth to 74 and beyond. And a new study from the University of Chicago shows that nearly all Americans believe that cogeneration will make life better. So people want to work across generations for things like a sustainable planet, for education, for mental health, and many more things. So guess which generation has the most enthusiasm for intergenerational collaboration? It's actually Gen Z, young people leading the way. And it's almost like they're reaching their hands out to us, out to their elders, asking for help. But the research shows that there are challenges too. And maybe you felt this yourself or in your own work, that despite there being this great desire to co-generate, most people don't know how to do it. We're a society that has let those muscles atrophy. People have forgotten how to be together and they need help rebuilding those muscles. We're used to seeing people separated by age. Children are at school, the middle ages are at work, older people are in senior centers and in retirement communities. But Vivek Murthy says that we need to cultivate a culture of connection as individuals and in our community programs. So at CoGenerate, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a movement of leaders like you, creating this culture of connection in your daily interactions, in your workplaces, in your synagogues, and in our larger institutions. So that essentially, instead of letting age separate us, we can actually use it to bring us closer together. So that when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging, we understand that age is a critical part of that too. So I wanted to share a few examples from across the country of cogeneration in action, because I think for us to imagine it in our communities, we have to hold that picture in our mind of what it can look like. So the first one I'd like to share is actually a video that I'm hoping the tech gods will help make work, but it's from our fellow Ellie Katz and her organization called Sages and Seekers. It's a short video, less than 2 minutes.
Janet, as we wait for this, tell us what a fellow is.
Yes. So at CoGenerate, we have had multiple cohorts of fellows who are leaders, social entrepreneurs. They've ranged from 19 to 84 who are leading their own cogenerational work in their communities. So we've had groups of cohorts coming together to learn from each other and be with one another. If the video is taking some time, I can move over to another example, and then when the video is ready, we can share it. So the next example that I wanted to share while we wait for our video is one called...
The fabric was flipped up, because I remember to flip up the fabric.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Another effort is called Generations Over Dinner, and it's actually a model.
Ability lead to social isolation and loneliness, which too often causes depression and a serious decline in physical health. Anxiety, depression, and suicide are rising among our teens. We are in the middle of the worst mental health crisis for adolescents in history. And for our elders, declining health and mobility lead to social isolation and loneliness, which too often causes depression and a serious decline in physical health and well-being. Sages and Seekers is a lifeline for these two marginalized age groups. For 13 years, we have brought teens and older adults together to share their life experiences, exploring what it means to be human, to succeed, to fail, to feel pain and joy. And through this authentic conversation comes connection, belonging. Last year, we enrolled over 700 participants in our evidence-based programs, which shatter stereotypes and develop empathy. And as our two clinical studies show, After 8 weeks, our participants, sages and seekers alike, develop a greater sense of purpose, value, and relevance. We have seen depression lift and anxiety diminish. We have the stories of transformation, and we have the data to prove it. But we need your support to continue our work during this mental health crisis.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So Sages and Seekers is one example. There are so many examples. I know that Dorot was in a small group, and that's another fantastic example of how to kind of rebuild that muscle of bringing people together and helping to forge those connections. The next example I wanted to share is called Generations Over Dinner, and I'll put the link in the chat in a minute, but it's basically a dinner party challenge to gather people from as many generations as you can over a meal. And it's something that you can do in person. You can even do it virtually over Zoom. And our staff did this recently at one of our retreats. And we had our youngest dinner guest was 16. Our oldest was 94. And Generations Over Dinner has templates of questions you can use and borrow to help guide your dinner conversation. So that's one example that you could do next week, or you could do even in your neighborhood. Finally, the last example I wanted to share is the example of co-housing. And this is a practice that's been done for generations and is now coming back and becoming even more popular, and is being done more and more outside of the family. So we work with an organization called His OC. It's Homeless Intervention Services of Orange County. And they wanted to address a problem in their community that they saw, which was that a record number of young people couldn't find affordable rent. And during the pandemic, some colleges in the Orange County area even opened up school parking garages so unhoused students could sleep in their cars. Meanwhile, millions of spare bedrooms sit empty every night, often in the homes of older adults who live alone, struggling to maintain their houses as they age. So organizations like His OC, there's another one called Nesterly. There are others out there. They're creating ways to connect homeowners and younger people who need more affordable rent, and to make people feel comfortable in that process as well. So those are some examples. I hope that some of those examples have spurred your thinking on how you might bring cogeneration to your community. And I'd like to turn it back to Laura to speak more specifically about what this could look like in the Jewish community.
Janet, can you make sure to put the links to those home sharing possibilities so that everybody has them? So again, we've heard not only now from Janet, but from some of you about the wonderful things that are already going on in your communities. I think the question is, what models can we learn from CoGenerate, and what some of you are doing, that others of us can adapt locally? What opportunities can each of you bring to your own communities to enrich the lives of active older adults and to strengthen the institutions that you work with? What are the partnerships? We've heard something about partnerships. What are the partnerships in your communities that you and your leadership might explore? It's not just you, those of you that are professionals, it's you and your leadership. What we learn about active older adults is that we want to be curators of our experience. We don't want to receive, we want to give. We don't want to be served, we want to serve. So working together with our leadership is really critical in terms of moving forward. What are you already doing that you need to be sharing on the website of the Active Adult Network so that others can learn from you? And really the question that Jess raised, how can we make this a national movement? It's great to hear that there's wonderful things happening in local communities, but how can this become a national movement so that the challenges that Ken put out in the, that the Jewish community is leading the effort in making this a movement like the civil rights movement? I want to just ask you, even though we don't have a whole lot of time, to take 30 seconds, take a breath, and to put in the chat one idea, one inspiration, one thing that gives you, that you're curious about moving forward, and just put it in the chat. So we're going to take 30 seconds and do that. Okay, I'm not monitoring the chat, but I'm really looking forward to what you're putting. And remember that we will take this chat seriously and figure out what to do with it when this day is over. So Janet spoke about co-housing. I want to begin with a personal story. I am a solo ager. I have a house that I've lived in with my family and my late husband. My kids are grown. My husband sadly died 5 years ago. I love my house, my neighborhood. I want to stay in my home as long as I can. I'm part of a synagogue village network, a partnership of 2 synagogues that's created an amazing community of active older adults and has strengthened our synagogues. Offline, I can talk about that with any of you, but the bottom line is I hate living alone. So for the past several years, I've been sharing my home with students, not renting a room, but sharing a home. It's been a wonderful experience for me. Meals together some of the time, their friends and my friends coming and going, overnight guests of either one of us. Welcome with an elaborate calendar that monitors so that we don't have too many guests at the same time in my not so big house. My first partners were a couple. They were both rabbinical students at the Hebrew Union College. We wrote a covenant centered around the example of the hospitality of Abraham and Sarah and the words of the book of Proverbs. By wisdom, a house is built, and by understanding, it is established. By knowledge, the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So these housemates of mine graduated in May, and they're now rabbis of their own congregations. And my new housemate is a third-year rabbinical student. Proverbs was right. There have indeed been precious and pleasant riches. So I know this is very sui generis, right? Not everybody lives next to a seminary and not everybody is a rabbi, but the example that Janet suggested, are there solo ages in your community who might be willing to explore this? Are there students who would value less expensive rent and the opportunities to become friends with an older person? And could our active adult network be a resource that could help people find these matches, right? I live in Los Angeles, you live in Kansas City, maybe somebody from Kansas City is moving to Los Angeles, maybe that person is interested. How could we tell each other that this is happening and help each other do it? So take a look at what Janet is putting in the chat and begin to think about whether this is something that people might be interested in. It's clear from all of us that do this work that creating co-generational projects isn't easy. Older folks often feel that younger ones aren't interested in working with us. Younger folks complain that outside of family members, they don't actually know any older folks. But what would it look like? Some of you are already doing this. To imagine our synagogues, our JCCs, the organizations that our active adults already volunteer for as co-generational opportunities. Not one-off programs like Grand Friends Day in our preschool that happens once a year, but ongoing programs, the kind of programs that some of us heard about in the volunteer workshop and that we know is going on. A year-long program for a community's teens where active older adults and teenagers study local civic issues, get involved together in a synagogue or a community social action program. Janet mentioned generations over dinner. What if one table developed a cogenerational one table, what would that look like? If it's working for generations over dinner, it ought to be working for one table. So once they get their new project about dinners for folks of our age cohort, what would it look like for them to imagine a cogenerational opportunity? An ongoing program where an active older adult adopts a family and celebrates Jewish holidays together. I mean, there are so many different possibilities. The village that I mentioned is actually exploring a connection with a new community garden where older and youngers can gather together, harvest food together, and distribute it to local food banks. We learned today from the Cumming Center that they're already doing that. So there are these models that exist around the country. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to get on a new bus that already can connect us with the other passengers. But it is a new bus. This is a different way of thinking about working with active older adults. It's a bus that not only pays attention to how diversity, equity, and inclusion is usually described, but along with that considers cogeneration as a part of inclusion. So I want to end with a story about one cogenerational Jewish experience. Our synagogue village has invited members to become participants of a national project called Engine. One of them, Janet Noah, will talk for a few minutes about why this project matters to her. Janet is a retired senior administrative associate at Cedars-Sinai's Medical Center. She was a reading tutor for a first grader, which evolved into mentoring for many years. And now that student is in college and they're still in touch. She continues to be an active volunteer and other stuff with a project for women's empowerment in the Congo and a restorative justice effort in Los Angeles. And now she's going to share with us something about Engine. Janet?
Thank you, Rabbi Geller. So when the Russians invaded Ukraine, it was horrible to see what was happening to this peaceful country. But aside from donating money, it felt like there was little else we could do. I heard about the Engine program during this time, a global nonprofit organization that pairs Ukrainian youth with English speakers for free online conversation practice and cross-cultural connection. Ukraine ranks 30th of 35 European countries in English proficiency. And at the same time, spoken English fluency is essential for many academic and professional opportunities. The commitment in this program is to volunteer once a week online with your student for at least 3 months. Since it's all virtual, it's a very easy and safe way to make a difference. You don't have to have any teaching experience, and the program provides you with training and resources. This was an easy decision for me. I had already been involved in other intergenerational, intercultural volunteer programs and have had the most wonderful experiences. I always learned so much from those I work with, and I feel energized after each meeting. Sometimes it seems we interact mostly with like-minded and culturally and socioeconomic similar people. And I strongly believe that the world would be a better place if we got to know people outside of our familiar bubble and learned that our similarities greatly outweigh our differences. So I was paired with a 26-year-old intellectual property lawyer. Yuli and I had very different outside interests, and yet we formed a special bond and interest in each other's lives and learning about each other's culture. We have had talks about our families, our daily lives, our pets, as well as more serious topics, the war in Ukraine, US politics, gun control policies, Supreme Court decisions, etc. And while Yulia was not familiar with Judaism, even though I might add, she lived very close to the town of Anatevka, which I never knew was a real town. And I shared her my Passover table where I included a social justice Seder plate. And one of the things on my Seder plates was, forgot what it was, something that was the symbol of Ukrainian. It was the Ukrainian fruit or flower. Honestly, I can't even remember what it was now. But what has been most amazing to me, well, what I want to say is she was very moved by the whole Seder story, and I was telling her a little about it and about talking about impressed people and freedom and what, and it was wonderful to be able to share that Jewish perspective for her. But what has been most amazing to me is to see how Yulia has handled the stress and fear of living in a war zone. She has been extremely resilient and optimistic as she balances her job, her family, her outside interest, and her safety, all while demonstrating a great love for her country. She really inspires me. The war seems so much more personal to me now. And every time there's an increased attacks, I check in with her as soon as I can. And I certainly hope one day we will meet in person. The program needs more volunteers, as about 500 students are waiting to be paired. To date, about 16,000 students have participated in the program, and the goal is to get to 100,000 students. This is a wonderful opportunity to have an intergenerational and intercultural connection while helping someone improve their English, which will improve their opportunities to grow professionally. It is needed, it's fun, it's easy, and it is definitely rewarding. And I will end up by saying that volunteering has been my joy and purpose in my post-retirement life. Thank you.
Jenna, thank you very much. One of the things that Jenna and I have talked about is that there are like 7 or 8 other people from High Village that are involved in this relationship with their own students, but we have yet to successfully get that cohort of us together to talk about our experiences. And I think that's the second piece of these kinds of programs, not only what we can do for the people with whom we work, but the way that we can create a community among all of us who are doing that kind of work. I want to just give Janet another minute. Janet O, another minute. Tell us, how do we work with CoGenerate? What can you do for us?
Yes. So in the chat, I've put our website, cogenerate.org, and would love for anyone who's trying to do this work. We know that it is hard work. It is not easy because it is about power sharing and making space for others and working in new ways. So through our organization, we host learning webinars, and then we also have fellowship programs, as well as some challenges where we are able to offer some grant funding as well for people doing this work. So please come and engage with us. I'll also put my email in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch.
So one of the things that any of us could do is to bring some of our leaders together and watch one of those webinars, because it will help us think through what it is that we want to be doing, and it will help motivate people to realize that this is something that we ought to be thinking about, maybe in a more coherent way. I'm struck as I move to concluding, the words that we say every Friday night in Lecha Dodi, Sof Ma'aseh B'machshava Tchila, for there to be an action, for something real to happen, it has to start with an idea, with imagination. B'machshava Tchila, it starts first with imagination. We can help each other discovering that imagination, and that's how we make things real. I want to really conclude by just making a reference to the Book of Ruth, the book that we read just last month on Shavuot. You all know that the Book of Ruth is a story of kindness and about how random acts of kindness can change the world. But I want to point out that it is also an unlikely story of cogeneration. The friendship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, whose connection to each other and the kindness that flowed from that led to the birth of King David and the possibility of redemption. It's a metaphor, but it's real. Cogeneration can open the doors to the possibility of repairing the world. Thank you all for being here, and please take advantage of CoGenerate. It's a really important organization, giving us the tools to begin to think differently about what it means to create the world that we are all hoping to create. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, Janet, and our guests. And we are truly now bringing it on home.